All right, welcome back, Social 10. This is another installment, part 3 already, right? Part 3 of lesson 1. So far, we've looked at what is globalization, the interconnectedness, the hyperconnectedness of mankind. How do we connect? We've looked at economic connections. We connect to trade with others who might have a comparative advantage. Now we're going to look at cultural, political, social, religious, and moral connections. So I'm going to go through some quickly, and then I'll stop recording, and then we can talk about any of the other ones that you guys came up with, and then we'll get a chance to look at the textbook before the class is over. So religious connections. How do we connect religiously? Well, I've seen a lot of my friends and classmates and students go on missionary work. Missionary work's an example of religious globalization. That they go and travel to a different place, and they become a part of a new community. And that changes the missionary, and it changes the community that they go to. That's religious globalization. That's globalization maybe being a beneficial force. Religious globalization maybe being a negative force. Unfortunately, when we study globalization this year, we'll see that sometimes when we connect, we have war. Sometimes the thing that divides us is religion. So religious globalization can be a benevolent force. It can also be a malevolent force. It may be someone building a well so people have clean drinking water, so they can survive past infancy, right? So that they can become an adult. Or it may be slaughtering people because they have different gods than you do. So religious globalization, how do we connect? Why do we connect? We have people within my religion that I've never met, but we have the same beliefs. That there's a head of my religion. That there's followers that I might call brothers that I've never met. There's, millions of Islamic people in the world. There's millions of Protestants and Catholics and Hindus and Buddhists and Jewish people. And what holds them together is a common religion, a common way of seeing the world. Why are we here? How do we live a good life? We also have cultural globalization, and I already kind of gave this as an example that although I'm close to 100% Irish, the Irish don't have a monopoly on cool ideas, right? So when we connect with someone else, I might look into a culture and say, I want to add that to who I am. So on Christmas Eve now, my family, we have an exchange of chocolate and books, and we pick that up from a Danish tradition. It's not an Irish tradition. It's a Danish tradition. And that's an example of connecting with others and seeing a cultural change. We have had a lot of cultural change. If you go back 1,000 years, tattoos were limited to some cultures. But now tattooing is very common to many people. But that kind of leads to a controversial part of cultural globalization. And that's a term called cultural appropriation. That there are some things sacred to certain groups. If I go to a Chicago Blackhawks game and I wear a headdress, that might be, I might think that, I'm just celebrating my team, the Chicago Blackhawks. I love them. But people might look at it as being disrespectful to a culture that I don't belong to, that it's cultural appropriation. Same thing happened with face tattoos. When Mike Tyson had a face tattoo, many people from traditional tribes in New Zealand said, you don't have a right to wear that tattoo. That symbol is sacred to us. It's not meant to be an ornament for your face. So even though when we connect, we exchange cultural ideas, we have to be careful because sometimes we can devalue other people's uniqueness by appropriating it. So did I appropriate the tradition, the custom of exchanging chocolate and books on Christmas Eve? Am I devaluing the Danish people? I hope not. But if during the election campaign Justin Trudeau begins to, like a chameleon, keep changing his appearance to suit the audience that he talks to, many people in the audience might find that disrespectful, that you're mimicking me, you're using my culture, you're appropriating it. Next up, we have political globalization. So when people meet, how is there a political element, a political dimension? Well, one of the big stories coming out of the world this summer was the regime change in Afghanistan. And one of the lasting images is people falling from airplanes trying to flee the Taliban and seek refuge. Seek refuge in a democracy, in America or one of America's allies. They wanted democracy, right? They craved the politics. When we meet, we talk about politics. Who should govern? How should the government be chosen? Who should the government make choices to benefit? What freedoms are there? And are freedoms, universal to all? And we have examples of democracy being imposed upon countries and people resist it. We have examples of countries wanting democracy and people falling from airplanes because they want to live in a country with democracy more than they fear dying in this country, right? They'd rather die trying to get to a democracy than live in a country with the Taliban. So there's a political dimension or nuance to globalization. At the end of World War II, the United States built the modern nation of Japan as a democracy. When we meet, there's a change that happens, and it's about politics. Quick story from 1973 in Afghanistan. Former teacher here, Glenn Miller, was, for all intents and purposes, a hippie. He lived in a Volkswagen microbus. He had long hair. He partaked in the local culture in Afghanistan. And one morning, he was laying in the back of a camperized VW van, so there's beds in the back, and it was shaking. And he thought, well, can't be an earthquake. He looks out the window. There's a tank rolling by, so he closes those little curtains for protection against the tank. But as he's peeking through the curtains, he sees the people running by chanting, "Democracy! Democracy!" 1973, there was a regime change. They thought they had democracy. It's 2021, and they still don't, right? But in the global village, there's ideas like democracy and freedom that are spreading, but also being resisted. For some, democracy is a threat. To others, it's the goal. Globalization is complicated because when we meet with others, we don't always agree. Speaking of which, that kind of leads us to moral. Morals are these universal truths, like thou shalt not kill. But when we look at globalization historically, literally we encountered groups of people that was kind of their defining characteristic, that we were really good at killing. We kill to survive. We kill to eat. That our culture is based upon being militant. That our children are separated from their families at an early age to become soldiers. Not everybody shares the same morals. So an example of moral globalization is when you come into a country and say, what you're doing there is not really acceptable. Cannibalism, we frown upon that. Ritual suicide, not acceptable. Human sacrifices, Aztecs, don't do that. I don't like that anymore. We're gonna move away from that. So there's a moral dimension of globalization that when you connect, you influence each other's morals. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not kill. It's a part of globalization. And finally, we have social. So in Social Studies 30, we're going to study the waves of feminism. And here in Canada, we've gone through 4 waves of feminism. There's a political wave, and economic waves, and social waves. There are some countries where they haven't gone through those waves. In Canada, women have been equalized. We see women as equals. Most people see women as equals. There are some countries where they don't. There are countries where women are still seen as property. So when we connect, we share ideas. Some of these ideas of how should we relate to each other? How should we relate to other genders? And that can create a social revolution. #MeToo is a global movement. So in summary, the takeaway today is we want you to understand what is globalization. People connecting. We interconnect. We connect with them, they connect with us, and we connect so much we're hyper-connected. How do we connect? Economically. We trade because they have things we want, we have things they want. But there's a good side and a negative side to that because not everyone is benefiting. Some people are being exploited. But we also connect culturally. And sometimes it's neat to add stuff, you know. We eat chocolate and read books on Christmas Eve, but sometimes we appropriate culture. And that can be disrespectful. It can be devaluing. We connect politically. We might spread ideas like freedom and democracy, but then there might be resistance to that. Or we might try to impose it and say, Iraq, you're being a democracy now, and that might create warfare. We connect on a moral sense. We might say your ritual suicide that you're doing is violating universal right to life. Your cannibalism is unacceptable. But sometimes this looks like ethnocentrism. This looks like someone trying to have a cultural bias. We connect socially, and we might look into a culture and say, why are you not equalizing your gender roles? You know, why are you not empowering women? They're 50% of your population. Your country could be so much stronger if you utilize all your assets. What is it about women that you fear so much as women as equals? Women don't get the right to drive a car in your country because you think that the steering wheel will have a negative impact on their uterus? How can you honestly believe that in 2021? So when we connect, change happens. And that's the story of today. I'm going to come by. I'm going to check your notes. I'm going to learn your names. While I come by, you're going to look in the textbook and read pages 32 to 33. It's about the OPEC crisis and how a problem in the Middle East changed the lives of the Lubicon Cree living in Alberta. Tomorrow, I want you to tell me how this story on pages 32 to 33 show us globalization and show us how people are impacted. And that's the end of the lesson.